Picture this, two of history's most brilliant minds separated by nearly 2,000 years, sitting across from each other in a dimly lit tavern where time itself seems to bend. The air crackles with intellectual tension as these philosophical giants prepare to settle one of humanity's oldest questions. Should we live by the cold light of reason, or should we embrace the burning fire of our passions? In one corner sits Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Roman Stoic whose weathered face bears the wisdom of someone who counseled emperors and faced death with unwavering composure. His silver hair catches the lamplight as he methodically arranges his thoughts like a general preparing for battle. Across from him, Friedrich Nietzsche leans forward with wild intensity, his piercing eyes blazing beneath that famous mustache, his whole being radiating the restless energy of a man who declared God dead and demanded we create our own values. The question hanging between them is deceptively simple yet monumentally complex. What should guide human life? The steady hand of reason or the wild heart of emotion? Seneca takes a measured sip of wine, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You know, Friedrich," he begins, his voice carrying the authority of someone who survived the chaos of Nero's court. "I've watched empires rise and fall, seen men destroy themselves chasing every fleeting desire. The answer seems clear to me." Nietzsche's laugh cuts through the air like a blade. "Clear, clear." He slams his glass down, wine sloshing. "Nothing about human existence is clear, my Roman friend, and that's precisely what makes it magnificent." The tavern around them seems to fade as these two intellectual titans lock eyes. This isn't just a debate about philosophy, it's a clash between two fundamentally different ways of being human. Seneca represents the path of discipline, of rising above our animal nature through reason and virtue. Nietzsche embodies the opposite, embracing our wildness, our creativity, our very human need to feel deeply and live boldly. "Let me ask you something," Seneca continues, leaning back with the confidence of a man who's thought through every possible objection. "When you were writhing in agony from those terrible headaches, when your body betrayed you again and again, what saved you? Was it passion? Or was it the disciplined mind that continued to write, to think, to create, despite the suffering?" The question hits its mark. Nietzsche's expression darkens, but not with defeat, with the dangerous gleam of a man who's been challenged exactly as he hoped to be. "Ah, but you misunderstand everything." Nietzsche rises partially from his seat, gesturing wildly. "Those headaches, that suffering, they weren't obstacles to overcome through cold reason. They were the very crucible that forged my greatest insights. Without passion, without the full spectrum of human experience including pain, what are we? Calculating machines, bloodless ghosts." Seneca remains unmoved, though a slight smile plays at the corners of his mouth. He's faced more volatile personalities than this Prussian philosopher. And yet, without reason to guide us, what becomes of that passion? I've seen passionate men start wars over insults, destroy families over momentary desires, throw away empires for the sake of lust. Passion without wisdom is simply destruction wearing a beautiful mask. The tension between them builds like a gathering storm. Here we have two men who lived through their own versions of hell. Seneca navigating the murderous politics of imperial Rome, Nietzsche battling illness and intellectual isolation, yet they emerged with completely opposite conclusions about how humans should live. Nietzsche settles back into his chair, but his energy remains coiled, ready to spring. "You speak of destruction as if it's always evil, but sometimes, my rational friend, things need to be destroyed. Sometimes the old values, the old ways of thinking, the old gods, they all need to burn before something beautiful can grow from the ashes." "Destruction for its own sake is madness," Seneca replies evenly. "I lived through Nero's reign, remember? I watched a man follow his every impulse, indulge his every passion. The result was chaos, suffering, death. When we let emotion rule us completely, we become no better than wild animals." The philosophical battle lines are drawn. In one corner, Seneca's stoicism, promising peace through reason, virtue through discipline, happiness through acceptance of what we cannot change. In the other, Nietzsche's passionate individualism, demanding we create our own meaning, embrace our desires and live with such intensity that we'd be willing to repeat every moment of our lives for eternity. But this is only the beginning. As these two giants prepare to dive deeper into their fundamental disagreement, the very nature of human existence hangs in the balance. Should we tame the beast within, or should we let it roar? The candlelight flickers across Seneca's composed features as he begins to lay out his case with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. There's something almost unsettling about his calmness, especially when contrasted with Nietzsche's barely contained energy. But this isn't the calm of indifference. It's the hard-won serenity of a man who stared into the abyss of human nature and found a way to master it. "Friedrich, let me tell you about the morning I was supposed to die," Seneca begins, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "Nero had finally decided I was too dangerous to keep alive. The soldiers were coming. I had perhaps an hour to live, maybe less." Nietzsche leans forward despite himself, drawn into the story like a moth to flame. "Do you know what I felt in that moment?" Seneca continues. "Nothing. No fear, no rage, no desperate scrambling for escape. Just clarity. For years I had trained my mind to accept what lay beyond my control, while focusing entirely on what remained within my power. My thoughts, my choices, my responses. When death came knocking, I was ready." Seneca pauses, letting the weight of his words settle between them. That readiness, that peace, that's what reason offers us. Not the cold mechanical calculation you seem to imagine, but something far more precious. Freedom. Nietzsche's eyes narrow. He's clearly skeptical, but he's listening. "You see," Seneca continues, warming to his theme, "passion makes slaves of us all. The angry man is enslaved by his anger, the lustful man by his desires, the grieving man by his losses. They dance to music they didn't choose, played by a band they can't see. But the reasonable man, he chooses his own steps. The Roman philosopher stands and begins to pace, his movements still controlled, but now animated by the force of his conviction. I spent decades in the heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. I watched men with unlimited power, emperors who could command armies, who could reshape the world with a word, reduced to quivering children by their own unchecked emotions. Caligula, mad with power and paranoia. Claudius, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Nero, brilliant but utterly corrupted by his inability to master his own appetites. And you think reason alone could have saved them? Nietzsche interjects, his voice dripping with skepticism. "I know it could have," Seneca replies without hesitation, "because I've seen what happens when a human being truly commits to living rationally. Not coldly, not mechanically, but with the full engagement of their highest faculties. They become something magnificent, not despite their humanity, but because of it." Seneca returns to his seat, leaning forward with intense focus. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because this is the heart of everything. When I say we should live by reason, I'm not asking you to become a machine. I'm asking you to become fully human for perhaps the first time in your life. The challenge hangs in the air between them. Nietzsche's fingers drum impatiently on the table, but his eyes never leave Seneca's face. "Think about it," Seneca continues. "What separates us from the animals? They feel everything we feel. Fear, anger, desire, joy. But they're slaves to these feelings, completely at their mercy. A wolf doesn't choose to hunt. It hunts because hunger drives it. A bull doesn't choose to charge. It charges because rage overwhelms it. But humans, we have something they lack. We can step back, observe our own emotions, and decide how to respond." Seneca's voice grows more passionate now, though his delivery remains controlled. This capacity for rational reflection isn't a burden or a limitation. It's our greatest gift. It's what allows us to love not just from instinct but from choice, to act courageously, not from blind impulse but from considered virtue, to find meaning not in whatever our emotions happen to fixate on, but in what truly deserves our devotion. He pauses, studying Nietzsche's reaction carefully. "You speak of passion as if it's always authentic, always true. But I've seen passionate hatred based on lies, passionate love rooted in delusion, passionate conviction serving evil ends. Passion without wisdom is like a ship without a rudder. It may move with great speed and power, but it's just as likely to crash upon the rocks as reach any worthwhile destination." The tavern around them seems to hold its breath as Seneca delivers what he clearly considers his strongest argument. Here's what reason truly offers us: the ability to align our deepest desires with reality itself. When I trained myself to accept death, I didn't become emotionless. I became free to love life more fully, knowing I wouldn't cling to it desperately when the time came to let go. When I learned to master anger, I didn't lose my capacity for justice. I gained the ability to pursue it effectively without being blinded by rage. Seneca leans back, his case presented with the confidence of a man who's lived his philosophy through triumph and tragedy alike. "You want to know what true strength looks like?" It's not the passionate man who explodes in fury at every slight. It's the reasonable man who can absorb any blow while keeping his eyes fixed on what actually matters. That's not suppression of human nature. That's its highest expression. The silence stretches between them as Nietzsche processes this challenge to everything he believes. His response, when it comes, will either acknowledge the power of Seneca's argument or shatter it completely. The philosophical stakes couldn't be higher. Nietzsche has been coiled like a spring throughout Seneca's measured presentation, and now he explodes into motion with the force of a man who's been holding back a thunderstorm. His chair scrapes against the floor as he leaps up, eyes blazing with an intensity that makes the candlelight seem dim by comparison. Freedom? His voice cracks like a whip. You call that death-like composure freedom? My dear Roman, you've described the most exquisite form of spiritual suicide ever devised. He begins to pace, but where Seneca's movements were controlled and deliberate, Nietzsche's are electric, unpredictable, alive with dangerous energy. Do you know what I see when I look at your perfect stoic sage? A beautiful corpse, perfectly preserved, perfectly peaceful, and perfectly utterly dead to everything that makes existence worth living. Nietzsche spins to face Seneca directly, his voice rising with passionate conviction. You speak of mastering emotions as if they were wild horses to be broken. But what if those emotions are not obstacles to overcome, but the very source of everything meaningful in human life? What if your precious reason is actually just fear wearing the mask of wisdom? The accusation hits the air like a lightning bolt. Seneca's eyebrows raise slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. Yes, fear, Nietzsche continues, pressing his advantage. Fear of pain, fear of loss, fear of the magnificent chaos that is actual human existence. You've built a philosophy of emotional anesthesia and called it enlightenment. Nietzsche grabs his wineglass and takes a long drink, using the moment to gather his thoughts, like a conductor preparing for the symphony's most powerful movement. Let me tell you about real human greatness, he begins, his voice dropping to an intense whisper that somehow carries more force than his shouting. It doesn't come from your rational calculations or your serene acceptance. It comes from the terrifying, beautiful capacity to feel so deeply that you'd rather die than live without intensity. He sets down his glass with deliberate care, but his eyes never leave Seneca's face. You mentioned my headaches, my suffering. You were right. They nearly destroyed me. But here's what your rational philosophy could never understand. They also made me who I am. Every moment of agony forced me to question everything, to refuse the comfortable lies that most people use to sleepwalk through their lives. Nietzsche's voice begins to build again, like music swelling toward a crescendo. Without that suffering, without the passionate rebellion against it, I never would have developed the strength to declare that we must create our own values. I never would have had the courage to look into the abyss of meaninglessness and laugh. The German philosopher moves closer to the table, his intensity almost physical in its presence. You want to know what your precious reason has given humanity? 2,000 years of spiritual cowardice, 2,000 years of people suppressing their greatest impulses, their deepest desires, their most authentic selves, all in service of some abstract ideal of virtue that bears no resemblance to actual human nature. Seneca starts to speak, but Nietzsche cuts him off with a gesture that's both dismissive and strangely elegant. No, let me finish this thought because it goes to the heart of everything. You Romans built an empire through passion, through ambition, courage, the will to power, but your philosophy tells us to suppress all of that, to become passive acceptors of whatever fate throws at us. That's not wisdom, my friend. That's spiritual suicide dressed up in noble language. Nietzsche pauses, and when he speaks again, his voice carries a different quality. Not just passion, but something approaching tenderness. Do you want to know what real strength looks like? It's not your stoic sage, sitting unmoved while the world burns around him. It's the artist who pours his soul onto canvas, knowing it might be rejected. The lover who risks everything for connection. The creator who builds new worlds from the raw material of their own experiences. The candlelight catches the moisture in Nietzsche's eyes, not tears of sadness, but the shining intensity of a man completely alive to his own experience. You speak of aligning our desires with reality, he continues, his voice now carrying the weight of lived philosophy. But what if reality itself is incomplete? What if the universe is waiting for us to finish creating it through our passionate engagement with existence? Your Stoicism teaches us to accept what is. I say we must have the courage to create what ought to be. Nietzsche returns to his seat, but remains perched on the edge, ready to spring back into motion at any moment. Every great work of art, every scientific breakthrough, every moment of genuine human connection, they all come from passion, not from your cold rational calculation. When Beethoven composed his Ninth Symphony, was he following the dictates of reason? When lovers look into each other's eyes and see eternity, are they engaging in logical analysis? His voice drops to barely above a whisper, but somehow becomes even more compelling. You've spent your life trying to rise above human nature. I've spent mine trying to fulfill it. And I tell you this with absolute certainty. A life without passion is not a human life at all. It's just a very sophisticated form of dying while still breathing. The silence that follows is pregnant with challenge and possibility. Two worldviews have collided with devastating force, and something will have to give. The air between them seems to shimmer with intellectual heat, as both men realize this debate has moved beyond abstract philosophy into something far more dangerous. A direct confrontation between two ways of being human. Seneca's composure shows the first real signs of strain, while Nietzsche vibrates with the energy of a man who's just thrown down the ultimate gauntlet. Seneca sets down his wineglass with deliberate precision, but there's something different in his movements now, a subtle tension that suggests Nietzsche's words have found their mark. When he speaks, his voice carries a new edge. You accuse me of spiritual suicide, Friedrich, but let me tell you about spiritual murder. His eyes flash with something that's not quite anger, but isn't peace either. I've watched passionate men destroy everything they claim to love. I've seen empire builders tear down their own creations in fits of rage. I've witnessed lovers murder the very people they swore they couldn't live without. Seneca stands slowly, and for the first time his movement carries real menace. Do you want to speak of authentic human nature? Then let's be honest about what that nature actually includes. Humans don't just create, we destroy. We don't just love, we hate with equal intensity. We don't just build new worlds, we burn down the old ones, often with innocent people still inside. The Roman philosopher's voice gains power as he continues, but it's not the controlled power of before. There's something raw here, more personal. Your philosophy of passion sounds beautiful in theory, but I've lived in the real world, where passionate men with power can create hell on earth. When Nero decided to follow his artistic passions, Rome burned. When he embraced his authentic desires, hundreds died. Nietzsche's eyes narrow dangerously. And you enabled him. You, the great rational philosopher, spent years as advisor to one of history's most notorious tyrants. Tell me, Seneca, where was your precious reason when you were helping to manage an empire built on slavery and conquest? The blow lands with devastating accuracy. For the first time, Seneca's mask of composure slips completely, revealing something raw and human underneath. You think I don't know that? Seneca's voice cracks with genuine emotion. You think I haven't spent every day since wondering if there was another way? But here's the difference between us, Friedrich. I learned from my mistakes. I discovered that when we follow our passions without the guidance of reason, we become complicit in horrors we never intended to create. The confession hangs in the air between them, transforming the entire dynamic of their debate. This is no longer just philosophical sparring. It's become deeply, dangerously personal. Nietzsche leans forward, his voice softer now, but no less intense. And yet you still don't see it, do you? Your guilt, your regret, your determination to find a better way. Where do you think those came from? Not from cold, rational calculation. They came from your passionate love of justice, your emotional connection to human suffering, your heart's rebellion against what your mind had accepted as necessary. Seneca looks as if he's been struck. For a moment, the carefully constructed edifice of his philosophy wavers. Even now, Nietzsche continues, pressing his advantage. You're not arguing with me from pure reason. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. You're arguing from pain, from the passionate conviction that your way of life has meaning, from the very human need to justify the choices you've made. That's not weakness, my friend. That's what makes you real. But Seneca recovers quickly, his training reasserting itself. And that's precisely why reason must guide us. Yes, I feel deeply about these questions. Yes, my emotions are engaged. But without rational reflection, without the discipline to examine our motivations and test our conclusions, we're just sophisticated animals following our impulses. Nietzsche laughs, but there's no mockery in it, only a kind of wild joy. Finally you admit that you're human. But can't you see that those emotions you're trying so hard to control are not the enemy of truth? They're its source. Your pain over your past mistakes isn't something to overcome through reason. It's the very thing that drove you to seek wisdom in the first place. The debate has reached a crucial turning point. Both men are now fully engaged not just intellectually, but emotionally, each forced to confront the personal stakes of their philosophical positions. Seneca takes a deep breath, visibly working to regain his equilibrium. Perhaps you're right that emotions drive us to seek wisdom, but once we begin that search, reason must be our guide. Otherwise, we're just prisoners of our own psychological needs, calling our chains freedom. Or perhaps, Nietzsche counters, his voice now carrying a strange gentleness. Reason without passion is just another form of prison, a beautiful, comfortable cell that keeps us safe from the terrifying glory of being fully alive. The candlelight flickers between them as both men realize they've reached the heart of their disagreement. This isn't just about philosophy anymore. It's about two fundamentally different ways of facing the terror and beauty of human existence. One man seeks safety through wisdom. The other demands authenticity through courage. One builds walls against suffering. The other tears them down in search of truth. The question now is whether either of them can bridge the gap between their worldviews, or whether they're destined to remain forever on opposite sides of the human condition. The intensity of their exchange has left both men momentarily drained, like gladiators catching their breath between rounds. In the lull, something subtler emerges, not the grand clash of philosophical systems, but the quiet revelation of what these ideas have cost each man personally. The candlelight seems softer now, more intimate, as if the room itself has sensed the shift from public debate to private confession. Seneca is the first to break the silence, his voice carrying a weariness that wasn't there before. You know, Friedrich, there's something you should understand about the life I've lived. When I speak of reason governing passion, I'm not describing some bloodless academic exercise. I'm talking about survival. He stares into his wineglass as if seeing the past reflected in its dark surface. I was born into wealth, yes, but also into a world where a single moment of uncontrolled emotion could mean death, not just for me, but for everyone I loved. When you advise emperors, when you navigate the snake pit of imperial politics, passion becomes a luxury you literally cannot afford. Nietzsche studies his opponent with new attention, perhaps sensing that something important is being revealed. I remember the night after I helped arrange the execution of Britannicus, Seneca continues, his voice barely above a whisper. Nero's stepbrother, barely more than a boy. Nero saw him as a threat, and I calculated that one death might prevent a civil war that could kill thousands. Pure reason, you might say. Cold, logical analysis of costs and benefits. Seneca's hand trembles almost imperceptibly as he reaches for his wine. Do you know what I felt that night? Nothing. I had trained myself so thoroughly to suppress emotion in service of the greater good that I genuinely felt nothing. And that terrified me more than any amount of guilt could have. The confession hangs between them like a ghost. Nietzsche, for perhaps the first time in the evening, is completely still. That's when I truly understood what my philosophy could become, Seneca continues. Not wisdom, but a kind of spiritual numbing, a way of avoiding the full weight of moral responsibility by hiding behind the illusion of objective analysis. I spent years learning to feel again, to let my emotions inform my reason, rather than simply suppress them. Nietzsche leans back in his chair, processing this revelation. When he speaks, his voice has lost its earlier fire and carries instead a strange vulnerability. Do you think your story is unique? He asks quietly. Let me tell you about the other side of the coin. Do you know what it's like to feel everything so intensely that reality itself becomes unbearable? To wake up each morning with your skull feeling like it's splitting apart? Your vision swimming? Your thoughts scattered like leaves in a hurricane? The German philosopher's hands moved to his temples, an unconscious echo of old pain. For years I lived in a world where every sensation was amplified to the point of agony. Colors were too bright, sounds too sharp, emotions too powerful. I would write for hours in a frenzy of inspiration, then collapse for days, too broken to even read what I had created. He looks directly at Seneca now, his eyes reflecting depths of suffering that the Stoic recognizes all too well. You learn to fear the absence of feeling, Nietzsche continues. I learned to fear its presence. There were times when I honestly believed that madness might be preferable to the constant assault of unfiltered experience. Do you know what saved me? Not reason. Reason told me to end the suffering any way I could. What saved me was passion itself. The passionate conviction that this intensity, this terrible sensitivity to existence, was not a curse to be cured, but a gift to be transformed into something beautiful. The two men sit in contemplative silence, each recognizing in the other's story a mirror of his own deepest fears. Seneca sees the chaos that unchecked emotion can create. Nietzsche sees the death that comes from emotional suppression. Perhaps, Seneca says slowly, we've each been fighting the battle we most needed to fight. You had to learn to embrace your intensity. I had to learn to reclaim my humanity. Nietzsche nods thoughtfully. The irony is that we both ended up in similar places, just from opposite directions. You discovered that pure reason without emotion is impossible and undesirable. I discovered that pure passion without reflection is destructive and unsustainable. But that doesn't resolve our fundamental disagreement, Seneca points out. The question remains, when push comes to shove, when we're forced to choose between what our hearts demand and what our minds counsel, which should take precedence? Nietzsche's eyes begin to regain their earlier fire. Ah, but that's where you're still missing the point. The question itself is flawed. It assumes that heart and mind are separate entities, eternally at war with each other. What if they're not? What if the goal isn't to choose between them, but to forge them into something new? A beautiful thought, Seneca replies. But when Nero stood before me asking whether to execute his own mother, I didn't have the luxury of philosophical synthesis. I had to choose quickly, decisively, with real consequences for real people. And what did you choose? Nietzsche asks, though his tone suggests he already knows the answer. I told him to wait, to think it through, to consider alternatives. I appealed to his reason. Seneca's voice drops. He killed her anyway 3 days later, in a way that was far more brutal than what he had originally planned. My reasonable counsel only delayed the inevitable, and perhaps made it worse. The weight of this confession settles over both men like a shroud. In the flickering candlelight, they look less like philosophical titans and more like two humans grappling with the impossible complexity of moral existence. The question between them is no longer academic. It's written in blood and years and choices that can never be undone. In the depths of their conversation, something profound has shifted. The grand posturing has given way to something more intimate and dangerous. Two men who have lived their philosophies through triumph and catastrophe now speak to each other as equals in suffering. The tavern around them seems to have faded entirely, leaving only the circle of candlelight and the weight of ideas that have shaped their very souls. Nietzsche breaks the contemplative silence, but his voice has changed. Gone is the wild energy of before. In its place is something quieter but no less intense, the voice of a man who has stared into the abyss and learned to love what he found there. Seneca, my friend, he begins, the word friend carrying new meaning after their mutual confessions. I think we've been dancing around the real question all evening. It's not whether reason or passion should guide us. It's whether human beings can bear the weight of authentic existence without some form of beautiful lie to sustain them. Seneca tilts his head, recognizing the shift to deeper waters. Go on. Your stoicism, for all its nobility, is ultimately a philosophy of consolation. It promises that if we align ourselves with reason and virtue, we can find peace, meaning, happiness. But what if that's not true? What if the universe is fundamentally indifferent to our suffering, our hopes, our carefully constructed moral systems? Nietzsche leans forward, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like stars in a dark sky. I've looked into that void, Seneca. I've felt the full weight of cosmic meaninglessness, the terror of realizing that there is no predetermined purpose, no divine plan, no rational order underlying existence. And here's what I discovered, that terror is not something to be overcome or reasoned away. It's something to be embraced, transformed, made into the foundation of a new kind of human greatness. Seneca absorbs this quietly, recognizing the courage required to sustain such a vision. And yet, he responds carefully, without some framework for distinguishing better from worse, right from wrong, don't we risk becoming exactly the kind of monsters we both despise? If there's no rational basis for morality, if everything is just power and passion and personal preference, then why shouldn't the strong simply dominate the weak? The question cuts to the heart of their deepest philosophical divide. Nietzsche doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he seems to be choosing his words with unusual care. That's the coward's interpretation of what I'm saying, he finally replies. Yes, I believe we must create our own values, rather than inherit them from tradition or derive them from abstract reason. But creating values isn't the same as abandoning them. If anything, it requires more strength, more responsibility, more genuine commitment to human flourishing than simply following rules handed down from above. Seneca raises an eyebrow. Human flourishing? That sounds suspiciously like a rational standard to me. Nietzsche laughs, but it's not the wild laughter of before. It's something warmer, more genuinely amused. Touché. But here's the difference. I'm not deriving that standard from abstract philosophical principles. I'm creating it from my passionate engagement with life itself, from my love of what humans can become when they stop hiding behind false consolations and start taking responsibility for their own existence. But how do we know our passions are guiding us toward flourishing rather than destruction? Seneca presses. Without reason as a check on our desires, how do we avoid the trap of mistaking intensity for authenticity, chaos for creativity? The Roman philosopher's voice gains strength as he continues. You speak of creating values, but creation requires discipline, craft, years of patient development. Even the artist must learn technique before he can truly innovate. Even the lover must understand the nature of love before he can give it freely. Passion without wisdom is just sophisticated barbarism. Nietzsche considers this, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against his wineglass. You're not wrong about the need for development, for what you call wisdom, but where you see reason as the master and passion as the servant, I see them as dance partners. Neither can create anything meaningful without the other. He pauses, seeming to gather his thoughts for one final push. Think about it this way. When you made your greatest moral discoveries, when you moved beyond the cold calculation that allowed you to enable Nero's crimes, what drove that transformation? Was it pure rational analysis? Or was it the passionate recognition that you had become someone you could no longer bear to be? The question hangs in the air like a challenge, and Seneca finds himself unable to answer immediately. In the silence, both men sense they're approaching something crucial, not just the resolution of their debate, but a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in a world that offers no easy answers. Perhaps, Seneca says slowly, the question isn't whether reason or passion should be primary. Perhaps the question is whether we have the courage to live with the tension between them, to think deeply and feel fully, knowing that perfect harmony between mind and heart may be impossible, but that the struggle itself creates meaning. Nietzsche's eyes light up with something approaching delight. Now you're beginning to understand. That tension, that creative struggle, that's not a problem to be solved. It's the very source of everything we value most about human existence. Art, love, moral progress, scientific discovery, they all emerge from the productive conflict between what we think and what we feel, between what is and what could be. The candlelight flickers between them, as both men realize they may have found, if not agreement, then at least a common recognition of the magnificent difficulty of being human. The question now is whether this understanding can survive the final test, the practical question of how to live when theory meets the brutal complexity of real choice. As the evening reaches its crescendo, both philosophers sense they're approaching something unprecedented, not victory for either side, but the possibility of a synthesis that honors the deepest insights of both positions. The air between them has changed, charged not with conflict, but with the electric anticipation of discovery. Seneca speaks first, his voice carrying a weight that suggests these may be his most important words of the evening. Friedrich, I want to try something. Instead of defending our positions, what if we attempted to build something new together? What would a philosophy look like that took seriously both the need for rational reflection and the importance of passionate engagement? Nietzsche's eyes widen with genuine surprise and interest, a collaboration between the Roman Stoic and the German madman. This should be interesting indeed. Here's what I've learned from our conversation tonight, Seneca continues, leaning forward with renewed energy. My philosophy of reason was born from trauma, from the recognition that unchecked emotion could lead to catastrophe. But in my effort to master passion, I sometimes forgot that passion itself can be a source of wisdom, not just an obstacle to it. He pauses, choosing his words carefully. What if we distinguished between different types of passion? There's the reactive passion that simply responds to external circumstances, anger at insults, fear of loss, desire for what we don't have. But there's also creative passion, the love that builds rather than possesses, the anger that fights injustice rather than seeks revenge, the desire that creates value rather than merely consuming it. Nietzsche nods slowly, recognizing something valuable in this distinction. Yes, and here's what I would add. Reason itself isn't the enemy of authentic passion. False reason is. The kind of calculation that serves power rather than truth, that protects us from life rather than helping us engage more fully with it. The German philosopher's voice gains momentum as he develops the thought. When I rail against reason, I'm really railing against the pseudo-rational systems that people use to avoid taking responsibility for their choices. The bureaucrat who hides behind rules, the philosopher who retreats into abstractions, the religious believer who claims to know God's will, they're all using false rationality to escape the terrifying freedom of creating their own values. But true reason, Seneca interjects, reason that's grounded in careful observation of reality and honest reflection on consequences, that actually enhances our capacity for authentic choice. It doesn't tell us what to value, it helps us understand what our values actually require of us. Both men are now fully engaged in building something together, rather than tearing each other down. The shift is palpable, as if the very air around them has changed frequency. So perhaps, Nietzsche suggests, the question isn't whether to follow reason or passion, but how to cultivate the kind of reason that serves life and the kind of passion that creates value. We need rational passion and passionate reason. Rational passion, Seneca repeats, testing the phrase. I like that. Emotion informed by wisdom, but not controlled by it. Feeling that has learned to think without forgetting how to feel. And passionate reason, Nietzsche adds, thinking that emerges from our deepest engagement with existence, not from our desire to escape it. Logic that serves love rather than replacing it. The two men sit in contemplative silence for a moment, both sensing they've touched something important, but then Seneca's practical mind reasserts itself. This is beautiful in theory, he says, but how do we live it? When we're faced with actual choices, moral dilemmas, personal crises, moments when we must act despite uncertainty, how do we know whether our passionate reason is guiding us toward truth or simply rationalizing what we already want to do? Nietzsche's response comes without hesitation, as if he's been waiting for exactly this question. We test it against reality, not the abstract reality of philosophical systems, but the lived reality of consequences. Does this choice increase my capacity for growth, for connection, for creating value in the world? Does it honor both my deepest convictions and my most careful observations about how life actually works? But that requires time for reflection, Seneca points out, and many of our most important choices must be made quickly, under pressure, with incomplete information. True, Nietzsche acknowledges, but that's where character comes in. If we've spent years cultivating both our capacity for careful thought and our sensitivity to authentic emotion, then our immediate responses become more trustworthy. We develop what you might call educated intuition, the ability to act quickly and well, because we've trained ourselves to integrate thinking and feeling at a level deeper than conscious calculation. Seneca nods slowly, recognizing the wisdom in this. So the goal isn't to achieve perfect balance between reason and passion in every moment, but to develop ourselves into the kind of people who can be trusted to navigate that balance wisely over time. Exactly, Nietzsche responds with obvious satisfaction, and that development never ends. We're not trying to reach some final state of philosophical perfection. We're trying to become more skillful at the ongoing work of being human, which means thinking deeply and feeling authentically, while taking responsibility for the consequences of both. As their conversation reaches its natural conclusion, both men sense they've discovered something genuinely new, not a compromise between their positions, but a synthesis that transcends the original debate. The question of whether reason should dominate emotion has been replaced by the more complex and ultimately more fruitful question of how to integrate both in service of a life worth living. The candle burns lower as they raise their glasses in a toast to the magnificent difficulty of human existence, and to the possibility that even the deepest philosophical differences can become the foundation for unexpected understanding. In the end, perhaps that's the most rational thing of all, the passionate commitment to keep thinking, keep feeling, and keep growing until the very last breath. The debate is over, but the real work of living has only just begun.